resource development. If we think about this, remember I'm emphasizing this is a different way of working. So in HRD, we know a little something about that, right? We should be helping to redefine how work gets done in organizations. We should be doing process redesigns, job redesigns, reward systems redesigns. So if we are saying to people, this is your job now. You know, your old job and how you thought about it is gone. This is what your job is. Sharing knowledge is part of your job. And this is how it's supposed to get done. Well, we can do that in terms of job redesign and competencies. And we need whole new reward systems to reward good efforts. And of course, from a training perspective, we've got to teach people how to do all of this, use these systems well as do that work differently. Okay, so the second category I want to talk to you about is worth of the individual. I can't emphasize enough and talk about in that technology domain, they never talked about this enough. For most individuals, what we know is our most valued asset, right? I mean, it's, why would I want to share that with anybody if for what I know, I get rewards and I get benefits, right? So there's kind of a new literature showing up around psychology that we as HRD professionals really have to get our hands around. People have to sort of redefine who they are. If I'm not all about just the knowledge I know, right? Because I'm just going to start giving away my knowledge in these new systems. And so I have to sort of come up with a new way of reconceptualizing myself in a way that I feel valued and meaningful, and I'm meaningfully contributing to the organization even when I'm telling you everything I know. Mm-hmm. So there's a real challenge there around reconceptualizing the worth of the individual, as well as finding new ways to honor people in organizations. A lot of our reward systems are around rewarding what you know, right? You get promotions because of what you know. Well, if we want people to share everything you know, then we have to find new ways that you can feel important and valued in other ways. And this is like very, very shallow literature based in our field. We have so much to figure out there, but it is a pressing concern. Informal networks. As I've indicated, knowledge is socially constructed, right? So we have got to do new kinds of networks in organizations. This is fundamentally how people will learn differently, learn new things, and share their knowledge. It's going to be through informal networks, and the real emphasis there is on informal networks. They have to turn to each other and then do their work through each other, letting technology help facilitate that, right? Not through technology. A lot of these knowledge management systems right now try to force us to do our work through technology. But the newer way of thinking is how we once again use technology as an enabler to do our work through each other. This pushes on the next one around more social space. These two go very, very hand in hand. It's because what we're finding is that we have to find compelling reasons to connect people. We've sort of built organizations where we don't make it easy to go down the hall or to a whole other floor of the building and just connect. We can't do that anymore, right? We built a different kind of organization where that wasn't allowed. We stayed in our department and our functions, and we only connected with people outside of our functions if there was an official reason, and usually one that was endorsed by management. Well, let's turn that on our heels now. Here in this knowledge age, what we actually have to do is get people talking to each other ahead of time of when they're going to need it, right? So, and this is actually, while I would never endorse some of the extravagances that the 80s were known for, a lot of corporate retreats where, 300 people would go for a 3-day weekend full of golfing and drinking and having fun. A lot of that was going on then. I met you, I know you. So that 6 months down the road, when I have an issue, I go, didn't I meet somebody that, you think I could find him again? And then you go to that person, right? So now, when we don't have a lot of budgets to send people, how do we connect people across organizations? We've got to provide them compelling reasons to connect without over-managing those things, right? And that's really the fine line for HRD, how we facilitate that without over-managing it, because if we over-manage it, it becomes hierarchical and endorsed again, right? So, social network analysis is an interesting new contribution to this field in terms of really understanding social networks. And what we're learning there is that we can map networks, we can understand who's connected to who in organizations, and once we can see that, we can also design different kinds of networks and facilitate those. Tied to a strategic objective, that could be very valuable. Certainly all of this pushes on a very different role of organizational leaders, right? It cannot be the overseer, the task manager, the goal seeker, the quality control center. They cannot be anymore. Instead, they've got to be actively facilitating this new work of connecting with people and really getting out of the way and being a resource connector. Right? So rather than having the work come through me as a manager, I just have to be a resource connector so that my employees know they can come to me at any point, and I'm not going to get in their business, but instead I'm going to help them connect them with the people who can help them do the work. Right? Fundamentally, this will also require that managers start to live in this new way of working too. Right? They start to do their work in this way. Power of politics, I had to bring up power and politics because this is a really under-researched area in our field. It pushes a little bit on that worth of the individual, but you know, the old adage that knowledge is power, right? Knowledge is power. Well, now I'm going to give away all of my knowledge. I'm going to share that as freely as organizations want me to. Then, thus, I have no more power, right? So, the real question then becomes, how will I be distinct, recognizable, and achieve my own self-interests? What new power bases will I have to find? Which I think pushes on the next bullet. We're going to have to see a whole different way of thinking about power in organizations then. The power distribution and sort of our traditional theories of bases of power are all going to have to be revisited if we truly achieve a knowledge-flowing organization. All right, so probably some of those power bases will be my networks, right? My ability to access resources. Probably, I might even be able to be measured by how much knowledge I share, right? All right, so lastly, my time is running short. We can't leave this conversation without fundamentally saying one of our biggest challenges is hardwiring all of this into the system, which is done through culture work. Right? A lot of what I've talked about, and you all, I'm going to trust, know a little bit about culture theory, and that's simply that we have a lot of behaviors we're talking about. We can change behaviors, we can change systems, we can change structures, how people are acting. But all of this has to go further into the system, and we have to start talking about a change of values, a change of norms, and fundamentally a change of beliefs in what our organization is and how we live, you know, what our true beingness is. So for HRD professionals, I think we're going to have to really tackle much more conscious culture work to really ensure that this kind of work is getting done. All right, my time is up, so I'll leave you with that, and I think we're going to have some time for some questions later, so thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lona. You had a wonderful speech. As you know, we are quite many speakers, 7 speakers will be present within the time. So each speaker will speak about 20-minute session, speech, and then we're going to Q&A session together later. Next speaker is Dr. Janett Watkins at the University of Georgia. She is the Associate Dean of College of Education and the Professor of Lifelong Education, Administration, and Policy Department. She will be present about addressing the talent gap through the organizational capacity development. Dr. Watkins.
Thank you. 안녕하세요. 네,
ideas today that I've been working on for a number of years, particularly with a colleague of mine from Teachers College and Columbia University, Dr. Victoria Barsick. And my work is addressing organizational learning or learning organizations primarily. So the focus of this talk is some ideas about how we might address the talent gap through organizational capacity development. And I'm particularly going to share with you some work that I've done with a student of ours at the University of Georgia, looking at some cross-cultural research to see if there are some differences that might be attributed to national culture and organizational capacity. Truly, as Rev. Reverence has said, in a society like ours, to be competitive, learning will have to be greater than, faster than the rate of change. And in order to do that, I believe we cannot focus on individual talent development. We need to create organizations that are structured in order to help us in that task. A recent study in the university in the U.S. looked at demographic trends and some of the impact on us in developing talent, particularly in science and technology. It's called Rising Above the Gathering Storm. Talent quests have often been a little bit like going after a star baseball player, you know, the top CEO of the world. I think instead, what we need to do is to look at, certainly we need to look at a global talent pool and the implications in terms of global talent migration and what that might mean to each of the countries who will be losing their talent. In the U.S., United Kingdom, Canada, much of Europe, we're going to see what they say is a greatest depopulation since the Black Death. Europe, in fact, will shrink to 7% of the world population by 2050, from nearly 25% just after World War II. Whereas East Asia, including China, of course, is experiencing the most rapid aging in the world. Meanwhile, in India, the working age population will grow by 335 million people by 2030, almost equivalent to the entire workforce of the U.S. and Europe. Clearly, these extreme global imbalances will lead to global migration. So, why focus then on organizational competence development? Whether you look at the talent gap in organizations as a lack of middle managers, as some do, a lack of key technical workers, especially in science and technology, which many do, or to looking for globally astute leaders, which I think is yet another extremely important area of where there is a gap. At the heart of most proposed solutions is the need for new competencies, new skills, as we heard this morning. Those new skills are not going to be developed solely by individuals. Organizations, as Wendy said, need to be hardwired in order to be able to develop those core competencies. And they have to do that by becoming adaptive learning cultures that can support the continuous learning of an often virtual, globally dispersed, migrating workforce. A global mindset is often referred to as a major competence of leaders in organizations going forward, and I happen to agree. But a global mindset can also be associated with organizations. At the organizational level, cultural competence requires that organizations have a defined set of values and principles, behaviors, attitudes, policies, and structures that enable them to work cross-culturally. They value diversity. They self-assess biases, manage the dynamics of difference, acquire and institutionalize cultural knowledge, and adapt to diversity in the cultural context of the communities they serve. They incorporate all of the above in policy making, administration, practice, and service delivery, and they systematically involve consumers, key stakeholders, and communities. This is no small undertaking. According to Crowhead and Hamel, core competencies are the collective learning in the organization. The core competence is communication, involvement, and a deep commitment to working across organizational boundaries. It involves many levels of people in all functions. Unlike physical assets, which do deteriorate over time, competencies are enhanced as they are applied and shared. In an issue in 2006 devoted to the talent gap in The Economist, they concluded, clearly the best way for companies to win the talent wars is to turn themselves into learning organizations. The trouble is that few of them know how to do this. Ardress and Schoen began a number of years ago talking about a theory of organizational learning. And they focused on how organizational culture shapes, supports, or inhibits learning. Later, Peter Senge talked about the idea of a learning organization. And in it, he focused on managerial skills, again, somewhat of an individual focus. But he talked about these 5 disciplines of personal mastery, team learning, mental models, shared vision, and systemic thinking, with systemic thinking being, in his mind, the glue that holds it all together. What was important about this work is that it helped leaders see how their worldview influences the systems that they create. I think that it was Ed Schein in 1996 who summed it up best. And he said, when one applies this notion to complex organizations that are systems composed of many subsystems, each of which is composed of many individuals, one can see that the total organization's capacity to maintain itself and grow, to continue to act effectively in the face of changing circumstances, depends on the creation of a set of shared assumptions that cut across all of those subsystems that survive in spite of changes in membership. This is, in fact, of course, the culture. In other words, the culture of the organization is both the consequence of the organization's prior experience of learning, where we were and what we knew then, but it's also the basis of its continuing capacity to learn. It is a vehicle through which we can disseminate learning. What the organization can or cannot do depends much upon the actual content of its culture and how that culture aligns or integrates the subcultures. The long-range adaptability of the organization will depend on its ability to perpetuate the core elements of its culture through socialization, while maintaining enough slack for the evolution of new ideas. In the work that Victoria Marsick and I have done, we've focused on developing a model that actually defines what we believe are some core competencies or dimensions that organizations need to have in order to be what we would call a learning culture or an adaptive culture. In our work, we believe that organizations need to be structured to promote continuous learning. They have to have a culture that values and provides resources and tools to support that learning. They need to ensure opportunities for dialogue and inquiry, including capturing suggestions for change and improvement from all levels. They need to emphasize team learning and collaboration to promote cross-unit learning. They have to empower people to enact a collective or shared vision. They need to create systems to capture and share this learning, and they need to make systemic connections between the organization and the environment, scanning the environment to learn and anticipate future needs. They need to provide leadership for learning through managers who know how to facilitate the talent development of their employees and who model continuous learning themselves. In order to determine whether or not a culture had this adaptive capacity, we developed an instrument called the Dimensions of the Learning Organization Questionnaire, or fondly the DLOQ. The DLOQ measures changes in organizational learning practices and culture based on this model. The instrument has been used and tested through numerous research studies across different languages, contexts, and cultures. Through the work that we've done, we've been able to validate the instrument, to validate, to ensure the reliability even across cultures. What's been particularly interesting in our past work is that we've also been able to identify at least a correlation with organizational performance metrics, particularly knowledge performance and financial performance. In other words, an organization that is strong in terms of these learning dimensions also tends to perform well economically and in terms of knowledge development or the development of new ideas that will lead to future economic growth. That work, by the way, it covered profit, nonprofit, business, and governmental sectors. So I think that what we believe very strongly is that certainly these are not the only dimensions that might predict better performance, but they obviously do make a difference, and there is a high correlation. So I did with Hai Dong Wang, a small pilot study looking at a couple of research questions. We wanted to take some data that had been collected by previous folks. Dr. Young-Sang Kim from Columbia University Teachers College did some work here in Korea. Dr. Miguel Hernandez at the University of Georgia did work in Columbia. And with Bei and Yang and Victoria and I, we had looked across a number of American companies. So we wanted to see if there were, first of all, did the dimensions hold up reliably as we went from one culture to another? And second, did we see some interesting differences in capacity as we went from one culture to the next? And I wanted to make one little comment, especially after this morning, and the focus on the economy that we've heard. I think it's an important part of our work that we're able to include Colombia. I think South America we're silent about South America and its role in the coming economy, but I think that might be a mistake. I hope we pay better attention to what happens there because I believe that's going to be a huge growth area in the coming decades. So let's see whether it played out here. These, again, are the dimensions as I described them. I did a little bit more narrative, but essentially there are 7 dimensions. Create continuous learning opportunities, promote inquiry and dialogue, encourage collaboration and team learning, establish systems to capture and share learning, which of course is knowledge management, as we talked about it, empower people toward a collective vision, connect the organization to its environment, and have leaders who model and support learning. These are the dimensions that the instrument measures. In this small sub-study, we had 695 participants from America, 906 in our Colombian sample, and 544 from Korea, for a sample of 2,029. Looking at the first question, we found that in fact the scales were reliable in each country, so that we could in fact feel with confidence that the scores that we saw at the dimension level were in fact validly measuring the construct of interest. And but what was perhaps more interesting was to see the contrast as you looked from one country to the other. And what we found was that if you, well, I should probably say something about how to read this chart. In our work, we talk in terms of profile scoring, which means that the most important thing to do is to look at the pattern of responses. Look for the peaks and valleys, the highs and lows. And what you'll see is a pattern that is different. And the pattern in profile scoring is much more important than the actual numeric difference. So even if a country scores lower than another, that is probably not as significant as the overall peaks and valleys. You can have differences in optimism. Certainly in this sample, we had differences in terms of hierarchical level, which, as you may know, also can lead to higher or lower scoring on the survey. So if you ignore the number to some extent, but instead look at the peaks and valleys, you'll see that the patterns have some interesting similarities, but also, I think, equally interesting differences. So if we build a globally collaborative network, we might draw on folks for different things. And what we would probably say is that all 3 of the countries and the multiple companies that we measured were pretty strong in terms of continuous learning, very similar in terms of team learning, and very similar in their emphasis on providing leadership for learning. That's kind of interesting, right? there is an interesting difference in where they were lowest. In the U.S., we were lowest in embedded systems to capture and share learning and empowering people toward a collective vision. That's not very good, but true. In Columbia, where were they low? Team learning and systems to connect to their environment. So making systemic connections was low. In Korea, the lowest were the promoting dialogue and inquiry and empowering people toward a collective vision. So if we thought in terms of strengths and weaknesses, we would then look at where were they highest. And certainly in Korea, I would look at embedded systems to capture and share learning and making systemic connections to your environment. This conference is a perfect example of making systemic connections with your global context. So these would be key strengths. In Columbia, we would say that they have great strength in dialogue and inquiry and empowering people. In fact, in the companies that were measured, Miguel heard again and again the conversations about talk to people. We just talk to people. That's how we find things out. We just talk to one another. So conversation is a major strategy for change. And of course, in the U.S., I think what you would say is that great strength in terms of making systemic connections and providing leadership for learning. And as we've heard earlier, many great CEOs have come from training in the U.S. Well, I think the other most interesting thing is where are the greatest gaps, and that was, of course, the second research question. And if you were looking at America and Korea, it would certainly be in terms of embedded systems to capture and share learning. If you were looking at Korea and Columbia, it might be in terms of making systemic connections with your environment. And similarly, between the U.S. and Columbia, you probably look at empowering people toward a collective vision as a significant gap in our different strengths. So we saw these differences. What was also important is that these differences were significant. In fact, the differences between these various samples were significant in almost every area. The differences between the U.S. and Columbia were significant except in continuous learning. Between U.S. and Korea in all areas except dialogue and inquiry. Between Columbia and Korea in all areas except provide leadership for learning. Well, there are obvious limitations in cross-cultural research. In fact, it's very frustrating trying to make meaning of these kinds of things. Different folks have critiqued it in terms of, how do you tease out the influence of an organization from the national culture? Because often organizational culture is very, very strong. Two of the organizations, one in Korea and one in Columbia, were American-owned. So what difference did that make? We don't know. So there are those kinds of things. The other is doing survey research across languages and cultures. Some folks argue that the language equivalence is never quite there. Although we did a lot of work with translation and back translation. In fact, Dr. Hernandez in Colombia even did oral administration of the survey so that he could, in fact, dialogue in Spanish back and forth in order to ensure that they, in fact, understood the questions. Nevertheless, language differences, language is meaning-making, as some others have said today. And so it becomes pretty tricky to do survey research across. Hofstede, who's done a lot of this kind of work, also talks about the challenge of, do you study IBM in many countries, and so one organization across many contexts? That's one kind of study. Or do you look at many organizations in many cultures? And clearly that's a very different, you're more likely to have the problem that I believe this study has, the potential for organizational influences to override national culture. And that may in fact be where we see some of the universals. And yet another concern that people have raised is the difference between emic or universal kinds of effects and etic or local differences. In this small little pilot study, clearly, I would say that if you look back at that chart, really the numbers weren't that different. I had to actually skew the chart in order for you to see any differences because there was such similarity. So, and what we were showing you in that figure were the dimensions, the larger dimensions that we talk about in continuous learning, embedded systems, and so on. At the dimension level, we might say that these are like universals. That in most cultures, we would see these as pretty important dimensions to have an adaptive organization. On the other hand, what we saw was extreme differences at the item level. And this might be more like the epic or local differences that account for it. In our work, we really want to do further research to see if we can, what I'd really like to do is latent cluster analysis, frankly, to see if there are some latent patterns that we can observe by using more sophisticated analytical techniques. So we're going to try that next. Well, where has this taken us? I think, first of all, you can see that I'm an obvious advocate for using the organization and its culture in order to grow talent, to recruit it, because an organization that is adaptive and open is one that we're more likely to want to be part of, and we're more likely to retain them. In an economic context such as ours, the downturn that we're experiencing, it could certainly be argued that the survivors will be those with the strongest pool of talent, most able to handle change and uncertainty. Human capital resources are obviously the bedrock of organizational capacity. At the same time, countries are realizing that their future prosperity will depend not only on natural resources or even financial capital, but on human capital. Where companies have been battling to attract and keep the best people, now countries are engaging in the same fight. Other the organizations structured to recruit and develop talented people, led by individuals with the capacity to work across borders of many kinds, hardwired to promote capture and share learning, will have the core competencies needed in uncertain times. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Watkins. The next speaker is Dr. Janett here from the University of Georgia. She is the professor of the educational psychology and instructional technology. She will present about the resource-based learning environment in a corporate setting.
Thank you so much. I am honored to be here with all of you today. It was just fantastic being invited to come over to your beautiful country. And it's my pleasure to get to talk to you this afternoon about some of the work that we've been doing back at the University of Georgia. I'm going to take you back to a topic that Dr. Rona started us with today, in knowledge management, and look at another concept that I've been working with now for, wow, I guess it's been almost a decade, around resource-based learning. Environments and how this could work in corporate settings in terms of creating opportunities for knowledge systems development. So in terms of what I would like to talk about today, I want to talk a little bit about resource-based learning environments and the primary components associated with that. Move into looking at knowledge management systems and RBLEs and how those two can be leveraged together to improve both systems, but particularly with a focus on knowledge management systems. I then want to show you an example of a knowledge management system that we've been developing at the University of Georgia, and then talk about some of the next steps that we're doing. What you're going to hear are some common threads, I think, between what you've heard Dr. Watkins talk about and Dr. Rona talking about, particularly in terms of the people and the importance of the people within an organization and how important that is for anything that we do. And particularly in picking up on some of the challenges that Dr. Rona presented, I'm hoping to offer up at least a solution, one way of looking at that with this particular idea. So we're surrounded by resources. There's lots of resources everywhere we go. We have the people that we interact with all the time, right? All the people that are in this room and other people that you know. We have the places that we visit that are resources for us for gathering information and getting hold of resources. There's all kinds of media that we turn to in order to get information, everything from books to articles to websites. And then finally, there are the ideas that we generate and that we get from others in conversation. These resources are our information assets, what Ali refers to as information assets, and they are things that we use in order to improve our performance. A foundational idea of a resource-based learning environment is that it does engage in resource-based learning. And according to Beswick, and this is from several decades ago now, 1977, resource-based learning involves the use or reuse of multiple resources to support learning. Now, it is not a new idea at all what I'm talking about here, but when Beswick first, and some of his other colleagues, first introduced this idea, there were several challenges that were out there. First of all, we were in a pre-internet age. I know it's difficult for any of us in this room to imagine that the internet wasn't here. But at some point it wasn't. And in 1977, that was the reality, is that we did not have that access. And so this was pre-digital. And so as a result of that, there was very limited access or difficult, challenging access to resources. You actually had to go to a library to get a book or an article, right? You couldn't just look it up. You couldn't Google it and get what it is you needed. You actually had to go somewhere to get a hold of that information. And the other thing that was going on around this time, too, when Beswick introduced this idea, is that our environments were still very instructor-driven. Most of our educational environments were that way. Several of them still remain that way today, whether that was in a training situation, whether it was in a university setting. The instructor was at the front of the room, much like what I am here today, right, driving that message. So what's changed in the last 30 years? Why am I talking about resource-based learning environments now? Well, there's been a continued growth of resources, as we all are very much aware. We have very easy access, not only to any to a particular type of resource, but to a variety of resources. Now, you can probably go up onto YouTube right now and see what's going on with anything that you might want to find out about, right? And so that makes this more of a viable idea. There's a lot of flexibility in terms of application and use of resources, things that we didn't have before. And finally, there is an economic reality. And we keep coming back to economics today. It seems to be a theme of the day, and I think it's because it's so pressing on all of us around the globe. But the reality is that it is increasingly more expensive to create resources. And now we have the capability to reuse some of those resources in innovative ways that we didn't have before. I know recently at the University of Georgia, as an example of a harsh economic reality, we had to cut some of our subscriptions to journals, right? Because we're having an economic downturn. Now we're going to be challenged to try and figure out how we get a hold of those resources in new and innovative ways. So in terms of knowledge management, economics may have been one of the other driving forces that really led organizations to look at how you can leverage information assets through a knowledge management frame in order to improve organizational learning. According to Rumazin, this is yet another, as Wendy mentioned earlier, there's all kinds of definitions of knowledge management out here. Here's another one for you to consider. That knowledge management are the processes that enable knowledge to be created, captured, shared, and leveraged within an organization. This idea became popular in the late 20th century, but it's continued in its use and growth today. I think that Dr. Rona gave you some really good figures on how much money corporations are spending in this area. So this is a really big area to be thinking about. And we saw in the 1990s a big push with the technology, with the information technology boom. A lot of information knowledge management systems were being developed and grown within organizations. And Dalkier offers us a definition of a knowledge management system, and it's actually one that we're using for some of the foundational work that we're doing at the University of Georgia. The knowledge management system is a tool that manages the sum of all knowledge within organizations as its intellectual assets. So again, coming back to that idea of how can you leverage that information in order to work for the organization. There are a lot of benefits that can come from a knowledge management system, right? So things like global opportunities, opening up your organization to others and trying to, and leveraging that information that you can share. You can create leaner organizations by doing this, because then you don't have people creating the same kinds of resources, but instead they're all sharing those resources together to leverage them in new ways. It can prevent organizational amnesia, at least we hope that that's one of the things that it can do. And it can also offer just-in-time learning in a 24/7, 365 model, so that your learners can get to that information or have that information pushed to them in ways that work best for them, whether that's in a formal training setting or whether that's at their desk as they're doing their work. But there are challenges. And Dr. Murray talked a little bit about some of the challenges associated with knowledge management overall. But some of the knowledge management system in particular, as we all know, you can build things as much as you want, and they can look beautiful and gorgeous, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to come. Even after all of that effort that you put into it. Another big challenge that you can face is from the very workers that you have in your organization. Now, these are two cartoon characters that are famous over the States, Calvin and Hobbes. And I'll point you to particularly the last two frames of the cartoon. You see at the beginning, Calvin's talking about the more you know, the harder it is to take decisive action. Once you become informed, you start seeing complexities and shades of gray. You realize that nothing is as clear and simple as it first appears. Ultimately, knowledge is paralyzing. So why would you do it, right? So being a man of action, Calvin says, I can't afford to take that risk. And Hobbes comes back to him and says, you're ignorant, but at least you act on it, right? And so you could have people within your organization that resist the very use of a resource that can help them do their work easier, better, more efficiently, faster, all of those things. So all of this has led me to question, why would not move to a more resource-intensive knowledge capturing and sharing model in organizational learning? I think in a lot of instances we're still relying on some of the old models that we've used for years. Tried and true and tested as they may be, they may not be the best way for us to continue our growth in our learning in organizations. So one potential answer to why it is we haven't done that is that we may not have paid enough attention to the human element, the people behind the technology, the thing that makes it run. Jack Welch talked about this morning. The importance of the people, the importance of what it is that's actually driving the organization. And McDermott points out that we have the tools and they're great, but they're not enough, right? Because ultimately, knowledge is a human act. It's something that only we can do. We can have the best computers in the world, we can have the smartest computers in the world, but at the end of the day, they're focused on information. It's all of us that create knowledge, right? And create knowledge as individuals and within communities. And those are really important aspects of what comes into components of a resource-based learning environment. I think that some of the things that are a part of this idea around resource-based learning environments, and this is something I've been working on with a colleague, Dr. Michael Hannafin at the University of Georgia for a few years now, may be able to then assist us in how we look at knowledge management systems and how we can improve what it is we're doing with those systems in our corporations. So what I'd like to do is just run through a few of these primary components and link those into knowledge management systems and the benefits that I think that they can bring. First of all, context. There are three areas that we talk about when we're talking about context within a resource-based learning environment. Those range from imposed, ones that a trainer or an organization says, here are your goals, this is what you're going to do, all the way through generative, where it is the learner or the individual worker who is determining what it is they need to know to solve a particular problem. So in here, all of these may be appropriate for an organization. What I think is key in the development of a knowledge management system is that it has the flexibility to be all three of these and not just one, so that you can do any of these things within the system. The resources, of course, are the most fundamental component of a resource-based learning environment, as they are in a knowledge management system. In this regard, you want to be able to provide a variety of resources, both static, things that can't be changed, as well as dynamic, things that an individual worker could go in and manipulate and make their own for their context. And how it is that the resources get used is also critical. And this links back to the goals of the system that you've developed in the context in which that's working. Having a variety of tools within the knowledge management system is also critical, ranging from tools for seeking out the resources and information that might be embedded within that environment, ways to evaluate that information, and then finally communication. So you want to enable the user of the knowledge management system to not just retrieve the information of the resource, but to also be able to generate, manipulate, and organize that information in new ways. The communication tools are a critical component in a resource-based learning environment, and one that's often not been included in knowledge management systems. And by embedding some of these communication tools within a system, things like discussion forums, or chat rooms, or instant messaging systems, then you can have your workers, as they're engaged in the knowledge management system, interacting with each other in order to develop new ideas and new knowledge. And then finally, scaffolds is the last component within a resource-based learning environment, and something that is critical in a knowledge management system. And scaffolds are designed to support the users as they're working within the system. Everything from how do I do this, the procedural scaffolding, to metacognitive scaffolding, what do I know and what do I not know, and how can the system help me figure that out. So all four of these are really important in terms of thinking through what we might be able to do with a knowledge management system. But how do we leverage those in order to improve what it is that we're doing with knowledge management and to take advantage of those? Well, I think that, and you saw part of this in Dr. Rona's talk earlier today, is that we can look at an integrated cycle of knowledge management. And this is Dalkira's idea around what it is we're doing with that. So this idea of being able to capture and create knowledge, to be able to share and disseminate the knowledge and acquire and apply it, right? And then intermingle that with those four principles related to resource-based learning: the context, the resources, the tools, and the scaffolding, right, in order to improve the system. What we're doing at the University of Georgia now, and this is a grant project that Dr. Rona is the PI and I am the co-PI on the grant. We are working on building a system, a knowledge management system for educational leaders in a variety of contexts, ranging from businesses to organizations to schools to government agencies. Ed Leader Exchange, and this is a very early draft, unless you see all the Latin words of our screenshot, is well on its way into being done with its first iteration, we're very happy to say. And what we've done in this knowledge management system is try to take advantage of some of the things that we know about knowledge management systems, as well as bring in some of the elements related to resource-based learning in order to make this an even stronger system than it might have been otherwise. And I want to show you a few things that link together with that. So in terms of knowledge capturing and/or creation, one of the things that we've done is we're facilitating both individual and group learning within the knowledge management system. We're also working to enable that connecting and sharing to support the capture and creation of ideas and knowledge within different communities. In terms of knowledge sharing and dissemination, we're building two big repositories as part of this knowledge management system. One of those are resources. So the articles, the other kinds of papers that people might share within a system. But then we also have the repository for ideas, so that when groups of people get together and they're creating ideas, those ideas can then be shared with other groups and other people that are part of that system. And then finally, in terms of application and acquisition, we have a very robust content management system that's running on the back end of our knowledge management system in order to give easy and rapid access to those resources just in time for the learner, and an ability to be able to personalize some of those resources. And in the paper, you can see a better chart layout, a little bit easier to read, on how resource-based learning and the Ed Leader Exchange are working together in terms of the context in creating an individual and group learning, these repositories I just mentioned, that idea of several different kinds of tools for accessing and creating and individualizing and sharing information and resources within that within the larger system, and then finally a variety of scaffolds, everything from just-in-time help while the learner is working within the system to frequently asked questions and site maps. So what's our next step with our system? Well, I'm very happy to be able to say that we are going to be moving into phase 1 of usability testing when we get back to the States. Our testing date is scheduled for the 17th of November, which is coming up really soon. We're very excited to get it in front of people and actually see how the system is working and getting that data back. We're continuing, we're using a rapid development prototyping model for the development of our system. So as we're designing and developing, we're rolling it out to users, and then we're designing and developing some more. And so we'll finish iteration 1. We'll have 2 more iterations of the system, with the last rollout scheduled in June of 2009. So stay tuned and we can let you know what comes of that. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have about the work that we're doing when we get to our Q&A session later on. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes. We are quite interested in the Ed Leader Exchange program. Next speaker is Korean Road UGA professor, Professor Dr. Choi-Ik-sun. He is the Associate Professor of Educational Psychology and Instructional Technology. Dr. Choi. And he will be present case-based e-learning for real-world problem solving.
It's my honor, pleasure to be here and share some of the work with my colleagues from UGA. My research focuses on learning in design, so in a real-world problem solving. So my presentation may focus on learning in design. Instead, others may have more broader perspective. I'd like to begin my presentation by sharing a short video clip taken from a famous Korean drama. The title of this drama is Continuum, which is the name of our historical character who became a famous royal physician in the middle of 15th century. This picture you are seeing now is when Jun was a student and was receiving an apprenticeship from his teacher. Jun is located on the right side from your point of view. His master's in the center, and the master's son, Ho, is on the left. He's also his father's student. You can see a nurse in the background. What you see is a doctor's office where the doctor and his students see their patient. Right before this scene, a patient was treated and walked away. And then the conversation among these 3 people begins. I'd like to invite you to the 15th century Korean doctor's office.
그런 쪽은 다 몰라고 다시 올 것이야. 그땐 침울로 벽에 불을 뽑아줘야 한다. 어디에 침울로 와야 하느냐?
예, 조태양과 동맥입니다.
조태양과 방광경 좌우의 혈이 몇 군데 있지 않느냐?
벤신주입니다.
침은 무슨 침을 써야 하느냐?
동치입니다. 불하고 마른 사람마다 다르지만 밥을 먹은 후 시간이 어느 정도 경과가 있는지 미리 안 후 맥을 확인하여 그때 동침을 써야 합니다.
침을 찌르는 깊이
처음 3푼을 찔러 사하고 병자가 3번 호흡하기를 기다려 다시 2푼을 찔러 한 번 더 사하고 1시간 끄에 뽑습니다.
맞느냐?
의서에 기록된 말은
네 생각을 묻고 있느냐?
의서에 기록된 말은 그러하나 그건 병자의 관부와 기억의 정도에 따라 다릅니다. 몇 푼을 찌르고 몇 호흡을 기다린다는 의원의 재량으로 결정해야 하는데 좀 전에 그 판단은 병증이 깊어 시간을 좀 더 두고 침 뽑아야 할 것입니다. 아니 무슨 소리가? 신경에는 침을 못해 사고 보하는 것은 병자의 호흡과 찌르는 깊이가 반드시 일치해야 된다고 나와 있습니다. 실장 어디에도 반드시 한 말은 없습니다.
뭐야? 됐다. 병자의 증세가 생애 일일이 다 적혀있는 것은 아니야. 대강의 병세 정도뿐인데 그에 대한 치료를 것이 못되면 모든 병자에게 쓸 수는 없는 일이. 그리고 신명을 쓴 사람도 조선 사람이 아니고 기호와 음식이라는 중국 사람을 하는 것을 알 텐데 의사의 내용이 금바옥처럼 보장도 없다. 책이란 읽은 것으로 지식은 아니다. 이때 깊이 생각하고 참 뜻을 알지 않고서는 바로 알아갈 수 없다.
Did you enjoy? I showed you this video clip to demonstrate again between where we are and where we want to be with education and training. As you saw, Paul on the left knew the textbook information very well and applied exactly what he learned from the book to solve the problem. In contrast, Hudson knew not only the textbook information as well as Paul did, but he was also able to modify what he had learned from the books in order to interact with the unique situation he faced while solving the problem. Everyone in this room would agree that the goal of both higher education and corporate training is to facilitate learners so they will become more like the Hudson title professional. They need to be able to make responsible, reflect decisions by applying their professional knowledge and moral commitment while interacting with various situations. But the reality is that our education and training may not be successful in doing this. Many training experts have indicated that 70 to 90% of the knowledge learned from corporate training programs is useless in the workplace. Many scholars have been wrestling with this problem by employing different constructs. Examples of this include routine versus adaptive expertise by Catano and Bransford, dualism versus contextual relativism from Perry, who established ethnic developmental state, non-reflective versus reflective practitioners by Chung, inert knowledge versus flexible knowledge by Whitehead and Spear. One of the common factors among these constructs that differentiate June from those is his ability to interact with situations. Dreyfus, an artificial intelligence researcher, claimed novice focus more on context-independent rules, and they apply those rules directly to emerging situations. As they become experienced, they begin to be more responsive to individual situations and to modify their plan as each situation evolves. Dr. Evan one of my collaborators, is an orthopedic surgeon in U.S. who has more than 30 years experience with practicing veterinary medicine and teaching at a university animal hospital. One day, he shared with me his thought about the importance of dancing situations as a surgeon. He said, there's no universal recipe that will work for each unique surgical case. However, there are a number of surgeons who force the situation to fit their original plan, instead changing the original plan to fit their emerging situation. More importantly is that this type of surgeon try to focus on teaching his students good recipe for surgical procedures, instead encouraging them to reason through a situation to solve problems. What's wrong with our education and training? And why do we fail in enhancing real-world problem solving? I'd like to further elaborate on this issue from the perspective of a typology problem. Problems differ in many ways. Among different ways of classifying the problems, scholars have classified problems according to how well problems are structured or defined. Well-defined problems are problems that include all of the necessary information to define the problem. These problems have clear right or wrong answers. Thus, application of certain rules or principles will lead to arriving at the right answer. These kind of problems can often be found in educational or training settings. On the other hand, ill-defined problems are situated in dynamic context and offer limited information for defining the problems and goals. The situated information has different levels of validity and reliability. The problem solver must evaluate in order to build and define the problems from their own perspective. These types of problems have an infinite number of problem-solving procedures that could lead to multiple solutions. This kind of problem can be found often in our daily and professional lives. The important issue here is that the knowledge required and learned while solving well-defined problems differ from the knowledge required for solving ill-defined problems. With various levels of complexity and uncertainty, different problems may be placed at varying locations on the continuum between well-defined and ill-defined problems. Many studies have shown that content knowledge, that is knowledge of our subject area, is important in solving most types of problems. However, metacognitive knowledge and epistemic knowledge, belief about how we build knowledge, are playing increasingly more important role as problem becomes ill-defined and context-bound. Therefore, as we utilize well-defined problems in training setting for many reasons, we face a knowledge gap between what our trainers have learned in training settings and what will be expected from them in the workplace. And my next question is, how can I develop a feasible model that can be implemented in current educational or training settings while using advanced technology to close the gap? I've explained existing learning models in our field and their limitations at the implementation level in my paper, so please refer to my paper for that. Now I'm going to move on to my solution. Based on three types of knowledge needed for ill-defined problems, I propose three types of knowledge integration framework. That is, in order to build learners' real-world ill-defined problem-solving abilities, learners need to integrate at least three types of knowledge through their learning experience: situational knowledge, strategic knowledge, and content knowledge. The situational knowledge refers to tacit knowing how to interact with situations how to identify important situational elements, and how to interpret situational cue to build situational awareness. Just being familiar with situations will be an important part of situational knowledge. Strategic knowledge is related to reasoning, monitoring, and evaluating our own thinking and knowledge, such as metacognitive knowledge and epistemic knowledge. The content knowledge is declarative knowledge of certain content, including facts, concepts, rules, principles, and theories in a specific area. The content knowledge has logical structure, is abstract, and can be represented through formal language. Thus, this type of knowledge can easily be delivered through lecture or written documents, such as textbooks and current educational training sets. I applied this abstract framework to develop a case-based e-learning module for anesthesia class. As you see the main interface of the e-learning module, students are exposed to the actual surgical process and the anesthesiologist's reactions to critical incidents which emerge during the course of the surgery. This is circled as a situational knowledge, as you see. Students also listen to the anesthesiologist's retrospective talk about his thought process while solving the problem. This part is circled as strategic knowledge. At the same time, students can access the relevant textual information which is indexed to the situation. Generally speaking, there's a knowledge either in our brain or among people. But we cannot see the knowledge directly. We can only see the representations of knowledge through different media and formalisms. Talking, writing, drawing, performing, making artifacts, and so on. Even in the same medium, such as talking, there is a formal and informal talking that may capture totally different dimensions of the same knowledge. Then, how can we capture or elicit different types of knowledge or different dimensions of knowledge from the same source of knowledge, which is hardly available in current educational or training settings? I've applied different kinds of cognitive task analysis to develop this e-learning knowledge. In order to capture situational knowledge, the expert reviewed thousands of relevant cases and reflected his own cases. Then he developed a scenario which could hold a critical incident that would have educational value. Then he developed a movie as you see on the screen. For the strategic knowledge, an in-depth cognitive task analysis which includes critical incident analysis and stimulated recall process was used. For the content knowledge, I developed a computer-based knowledge elicitation tool where the expert could break down their knowledge into small chunks and save the database. Then the individual chunks of knowledge are indexed to the situation through the tool that I developed. Based on this framework, I've been developing a variety of case-based e-learning modules across different disciplines, through which I can test the theoretical framework, its feasibility, and its effectiveness for learning and problem solving. Recently, I've completed a 4-year-long research and development project for classroom management in teacher education at UGA. My research group designed a case-based e-learning module to help research teachers solve classroom dilemma problems. A series of 3 experimental studies have proven the effectiveness of the module in real-world problem solving, which also validate the effectiveness of my framework. These 3 types of knowledge integration framework provide a number of implications for each application. First, this framework can be guideline for HR professionals when they evaluate and select training programs or design and develop training programs by carefully assessing what types of knowledge are facilitated through the program. Second, when HR professionals apply this framework for their decision, they should consider this framework in a larger context, including the learner's prior knowledge, the intended learning outcomes, and the individual's workplace. They should make a decision based on the balance of these three types of knowledge. Lastly, the framework encourages trainers to value practical and situational knowledge as it emerges in the workplace. The e-learning example provided in this presentation also demonstrates innovative methods which may enable HR professionals to identify practical and situational knowledge, to make invisible knowledge visible, and to impress this type of hidden knowledge within training settings in order to enhance people's real-world problem-solving abilities. Our work and demonstrations and relevant papers are available at our web-based e-learning group website. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shea. Next speaker is Dr. Ronald Severo from University of Georgia. He's the professor and head of the Lifelong Education Administration and Policy Department. He will present about integrating physicians' judgment and social system in practice-based medical education.
Good afternoon. We were in the United States. Everyone at this point would stand up and stretch. Can we do that? Sitting okay? It's very good to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And thank you, Dr. Che, for a very good lead-in to my presentation here. He gave us the example of Do and Jung. So, would you rather be treated by Do or Jung? Who would rather be treated by Do? Who would rather be treated by Jung? Right. So that's the point that I'd like to build upon here for my presentation. I think at one point Dr. Che said, there's a quote that said, "Nowhere in the book does it say always," and I think that that I'm going to try to help think about that problem and solve it. My presentation is going to be more at a 30,000-foot level. These have been excellent presentations, but I would like to give a broader perspective and try to predict the future for us. I've changed this title to Lifelong Professional Development of Physicians Through Practice-Based Education because we've been here for a week and I really have a better understanding of your system of human resource development in Korea, and I'd like to try to contextualize my presentation in this current context. I'm going to be talking about a specific profession, which is medicine, physicians, and I'm going to be talking about the healthcare industry. Jack Welch, if you heard his presentation, said we have a lot of problems in the United States. He didn't mention healthcare, but that is certainly a very huge problem. And what I think we're going to see after the election today, and certainly going forward in the next couple of years, is a radical reformation of the healthcare system in the United States. And one of the central strategies for improving that system is going to be lifelong professional development of physicians who clearly are at kind of lead of that system since they do the diagnosis and prescriptions. I'm also going to try to give you a 50-year perspective on this topic because we're right at a tipping point right now. I think we've been dreaming about this vision in the United States, and I think as we get into healthcare, healthcare reform, that's going to be the final dynamic that pushes us to begin to realize this vision over the next 20 years. This is called lifelong professional development. I want to say why this is new and different before I get into some other specifics. The traditional view of professional education, not just in the United States but worldwide, is we invest an incredible amount of resources in talent identification and in the initial training of professionals. And that is true for physicians, lawyers, social workers, human resource developers. You've come through a very rigorous selection process to get into the university. You've had very rigorous education. And just like the physicians, you know what the system says to you, you figure out the next 30 years of your education and learning. So we have a huge investment at the front end in professional education and very little thought to systematically educating professionals over the life span. And the new view that I'd like to present to you today has three characteristics. First of all, we're going to see an integration of the continuum of professional education, where pre-service preparation, initial practice and induction, which is the second phase, and continuing education will now be integrated. We will begin to see a system of lifelong professional education and not a disintegrated system. The second thing is we're going to educate for John. We're going to base our education in practice. And I can give you numerous examples. I'm not going to go into details now because I think they're specific to the United States, but I think you're seeing this worldwide. It's going to be practice-based. And finally, this lifelong professional development system is going to be a partnership of higher education, workplaces, and the private sector, insurance companies, and everybody else who is involved. So I'm going to skip through a couple of slides here. And say that what I'm going to like to do, and I'd like to get through this pretty quickly because we have two outstanding presentations from our colleagues at Chung-Ang that I want to make sure that we have the opportunity to hear their full presentation because I've read their papers and they're really outstanding. I'd like to briefly talk to you about this long historical view of practice-based education and talk to you about 3 eras of practice-based education and where we are now and where we're going. I'd like to talk about the central concept that is driving this new vision, and that is that we really need to be about improving physicians' clinical judgments in social systems. That's exactly what John was saying. It's not in the book. You know, it doesn't say always in the book, so you need to understand the context in which you're working and how to make the best clinical judgment. I know you would like that when you go see a doctor, right? You want to make sure that he or she gives you absolute best care, makes the best clinical judgment about you, not about an abstract patient, but about you in real time. So, and then I'll just wrap up with some, what I see is 4 lessons for improving practice-based medical education. What I think is what we're going to look like in 2020 or 2025. I really believe that there is going to be change in the air. Sorry. Okay. So I think that we have experienced and currently experience 3 different eras or models of practice-based medical education. And I really think you could map these onto any profession that if you're a member of any profession, you might recognize some of these. The first one, this is the historic model of professional education, what I call the content model. The concept here is you go through universities, you get the building blocks of all the knowledge you need, and then all you do for the next 30 years of your career is just update that knowledge. You just keep building onto that knowledge. And so if if I were to say, how does this model understand the problem of practice-based learning, I would say they see it as a knowledge problem. And so continuing education and lifelong learning is simply the extension of university faculty members' research. Like, what's the newest knowledge? Let's just keep building on that. This model, I believe, is still the dominant model. We're certainly practicing it today in this room. We see it all the time, and it's not universally bad, but it is way overused in professional education. Somewhere in the 1960s, the idea came out, well, maybe it's not a knowledge problem. Maybe it makes sense to actually go out and talk to physicians and find out what they're doing, what their practice setting is, what knowledge they actually need, and that these are actually adult learners. And so this is what I would call the process model. It now sees the problem of practice-based education not as a knowledge problem, but as a learning problem. So what you need to do, the way we've operationalized that in our practice in the HRD and professional education, is you do needs assessments and you find out what people need to know. This is a very good thing. You know, this has really advanced us. We've really improved medical care globally because we've done it that way. And this continues to be a very advanced model and one that exists along with the content model. I think as we think about this system of lifelong professional education, I think that we are now, I think a lot of forces are converging to move beyond the process model to what I'm calling the context model. So the focus is not just on the individual, but the individual physician in context, in that hospital setting, seeing a particular patient in a hospital setting or in an office setting, so that you cannot just focus on the individual learner, but you really have to understand the context also at the same time. And if I were to characterize this, I would say, well, the content model frames it as a knowledge problem, the process model frames it as a learning problem, the context model frames it as a system problem. A system problem. So if you really want to help, if you really want physicians to give better care to patients, you really need to see the individual making clinical decisions in a specific context and build your learning and education around that. So those are the three eras. I believe this third era, hopefully, not just my belief, a lot of people believe this is really one that should define the future of lifelong professional education. So the focus now becomes where physicians learn. Where physicians learn, not how physicians learn, but where they learn, to take the full context into account. And it's just our educational efforts and our learning efforts should seek to improve physicians' clinical judgments. You want that physician to make the best clinical judgments. And you go into that physician's office, you want them to make the best clinical judgments so that your health improves. But we also have to understand that that individual is not a free agent. They're enabled and constrained by a number of factors that I'll just talk about briefly here, and that those contextual factors have an awful lot to do with how you are treated. And I want to talk about both of these pieces. Both the clinical judgments matter. Why clinical judgments matter? This is Derek Bach, who was the president of Harvard University at the time at which Harvard moved to a problem-based medical school. So the idea was not just to teach physicians all the knowledge and then they just go apply that knowledge, but rather, as President Bach said, few doctors are now inclined to think of themselves as simply arriving at logically determined conclusions by applying scientifically tested truths to experimentally derived data. Considerations of many kinds are often jumbled together to form a picture full of uncertainties, requiring the most delicate kinds of judgments and intuitions. So I mean, I think that most, if not all, professionals will tell you what they do. They don't just apply knowledge. They don't just take knowledge out of their head and say, I'm going to apply it. And I think that's what Dr. Doe is doing, right? But rather they're about making judgments in real time with you as a patient. Who are you? What is your history? Who is your family? What are previous diagnoses? So he or she is making that judgment in real time. So I think part of what we'll be doing in this system of lifelong professional education is really focusing on improving clinical judgments. But that's only half the story. Why social systems matter in healthcare. There's a lot of emphasis now in the United States. I would love to see some of the data for Korea on this. The Institute of Medicine did a study in the late 90s and found that somewhere every year, in the United States, between 44,000 and 88,000 people check into a hospital and die in that hospital, due to errors made in the application of medical care. This is a problem. And what that study found was that it really wasn't a knowledge problem. It really wasn't that the physicians or the nurses didn't have the knowledge. What they found for the most part, most of these deaths were caused by system errors, lack of communication, reading the wrong dosage, not having systems in place to care for the patients over the long term, checking them out too early, all kinds of things that were not about an individual decision, but were about the systems that were in place. And so in 2005, there's been a lot of discussion about this in the healthcare, and I think, as this quote says from Berwick, that the concept that bad systems, not people, lead to the majority of errors and injuries has become a mantra in healthcare. I mean, most people working in healthcare now believe this and are acting on this proposition. So I think that it's worth paying attention to this because this is quite a serious matter. So, so if we're going to try to change physicians' practices, what do we know? There's been a number of reviews on this, lots of research around this, and I've summarized these into three. First of all, there are no magic bullets. There isn't just one thing you can do. You can't just educate physicians. You can't just change how they're paid. There's not a single thing you can do that'll produce, in every case, effective medical care. They don't work, these strategies don't work because physicians practice in complex networks that defy single interventions for universally shaping practice patterns. And any change strategy, including education, must assume that physicians' clinical judgments are both enabled, in other words, you're able to make a good decision, and constrained by the system dimensions of the work context. And so I'm going to just wrap up with, if you buy all of this, if you believe all of this, and if you were trying to reshape your systems of lifelong professional education, of course for physicians, but I would say also for human resource developers or any profession, I would suggest there's 4 areas to work on. First of all, we've done a lot of good work on experiential learning, reflective practice. This has been a wonderful new strategy. It's not new so much anymore, but a wonderful strategy. But I think that what we need to focus on is we're going to improve clinical judgments. Is that we not see this reflective practice or experiential learning as simply an individual activity. That we really focus on the individual learner in the context of other physicians and other health professionals that he or she works with, so that they can reflect together And I think you heard that from a number of our presenters this morning, Dr. Verona, Dr. Hill, and so on. The notion of knowledge is just not an individual construct, but it's a collective concept. It's certainly something that is probably more consistent with your culture here than it is with ours, but certainly the notion of group norms, group knowledge. And so I think that as if we're thinking about improving clinical judgments, that we should really focus on the place in which those occur in the group that is working together. But that alone is not going to do it. We also need to learn for system improvement. We can't just improve the individual. We have to improve the system. And so educational, as say here, intervention should provide ways for physicians and other members of the office staff and healthcare team. Those are very important players in this. That how they reflect on ways for organizational processes that enable and constrain effective medical practice. We need to learn how to make the system better. We need to create systems that will more enable than constrain the physician making good judgments, or the human resource developer making good judgments in that context. So learning for improving clinical judgments, learning for system improvement. Probably the most progressive thing that's being done right now in medical education is integrating quality improvement systems that are in hospitals and continuing education systems. And those two work together like a bicycle, where you can think of two cycles, and the learning, the quality improvement feeds data and information into the learning and staff development and continuing education programs. So I would say that if you're looking for a practical way, if I were a continuing professional educator in a hospital setting, this is what I would do. I would go to the QI department and I'd say, work with me. Let's improve medical care in our hospital. Let us work together. So that's a practical suggestion. And finally, at a policy level, the way that we credential our professionals in the United States, and I think this is true worldwide, is we ask you to go sit in a classroom like this, and we give you credit and say, hopefully, that you've learned something. And I think we're beginning to see that changing in the U.S., where policymakers are doing relicensing and recertification and accreditation, are moving away, are beginning to think about systems that don't just accumulate credits for sitting in rooms like this, but accumulate credits and reward effective practice-based individual and system. So, see me again in 2020, and I hope and our dream and our vision is that we will have a much more integrated system of lifelong professional development for physicians, which I believe is going to provide examples and lead the way for similar systems in other professions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker is Dr. Chung-Ang from Chung-Ang University. He is the professor and head of the HRD Policy Department at the GHRF Graduate School, Chung-Ang University. And he will present HRD professionals' roles and competencies in the age of Web 2.0.
I'm very pleased to present my paper at this session. The topic that I will present is about HRD professionals' roles and competencies at the age of Web 2.0. So actually, I choose this topic because this session focuses on HRD professionals' competencies, and my specialty is in instructional technology. So this is the table. This is contents of this presentation. I'd like to start from explaining the background of these papers. So with the advancement of the technologies, the application of the web into the education has gaining increasingly attention. However, the application of the web into the HRD is scarce. So to answer these questions, I will identify the definitions and the technological principles of Web 2.0 service, the first, and then explore implication of Web 2.0 for HRD professions. And finally, investigate roles and competencies required for Web 2.0 AD professionals. Before starting this session, I'd like to ask one question. What is Web 2.0? So, defining Web 2.0 is like grasping water in your hands. Because although you try to pour the water, nothing is left in the end. So in other words, we try to actually define the meaning of the Web 2.0. We cannot actually pursue, we cannot reach the common sense for the meanings. This reminds me also of the story of the blind man and the elephant. Some scholars actually emphasize the technical aspects of the Web 2.0, whereas the others emphasize the interactivity of users supported by Web 2.0. So then, can we find the definition for Web 2.0? So I will throw a definition from the Wikipedia, and then the Wikipedia, according to Wikipedia, Web 2.0 is a term that describes the trends in the use of the web, and that it aims to enhance creativity and the collaboration and the functionality of the web. Actually, the notion of web as a participation platform is found the remarks from the Tim O'Reilly, who's the founder of Web 2.0. Actually, he suggests that Web 2.0 is business revolutions in the computer industry caused by the move to the internet as platforms. The team role is to build an application that harness proactive intelligence. So, despite the complexity of defining the Web 2.0, so several technological principles can be found from the search. So the first principle is web is a participation platform that consists of micro contents. So therefore, it is easy to remixing and it can be combined with data and service. And then also contents can be put together with mashup technologies. The examples can be found from the critical websites and Google Map with the housing sales, housing.com website. So users can create and upload their contents in the website, and they can also create another service. So with the mashup technologies. And the second principle is that user creates values, and their values increase when more people are using it. So examples can be found from the Wikipedia and Amazon.com. So users can contribute to the encyclopedia in Wikipedia explicitly, whereas the collaborative built-in can be used to suggest for customers to buy the books at Amazon.com. The third principle that I would like to mention is the long tail that is characterized by decreasing curves. So it is traditionally believed that the selling large volumes of the popular items can make more money. However, with the advancement of the technologies, the business such as the internet bookstores can make more money by selling lower volumes of hard-to-find the products. So perpetual data is also another principle. The web is constantly refined and improved. So based on these technological characteristics, several implications can be suggested for HRD professions. The first is the organizations they should have openness to dynamic capabilities. So when considering the dynamics of the system provided by Web 2.0, and also second, a mechanism should be arranged to support the user's ownership and self-directed learning skills. The third, checking out linkage and no-clue is more important at the age of Web 2.0. Also, it is important to take advantage of the long tails. So a careful attention should be paid attention to the service that cannot be found elsewhere and that has rare features. Also, it is to build a knowledge management system that supports informal learning. So then I'll move to the HRD professionals' roles. So to answer these questions, so we need to think about the learner characteristics at the age of Web 2.0. The learners at the age of Web 2.0 are characterized by, are often called as net generations or digital natives. They are very comfortable to not only using the new technology, but also learning from the multiple sources of information. So then what kind of roles are needed for HR professionals to increase or to facilitate next generation's ability of learning and performance? So to answer these questions, the previous study on the roles for HR professionals were reviewed. Actually, the previous study, many roles, suggests many roles are important. These are the list of the roles suggested by Janett, and also, Gary also suggested 4 roles. And currently, ASPD actually provides the competence models, and within the models, four roles are suggested as important. They include learning strategies, business partners, project managers, and professional specialists. So then, is there specific roles required for HR professionals at the age of Web 2.0? It is believed that the roles for HR professionals are very flexible at the age of Web 2.0. In fact, all roles can be conducted by all participants, such as learning strategies, business partners, due to the freedoms. So, therefore, it may be more important to capture and analyze and apply the essential capabilities from the HR professionals, depending on the situational needs, instead of identifying a specific roles at the age of Web 2.0. So then, is there a specific competency required for HR professionals? To answer, in other words, are existing competency values, or do they require any changes? To answer these questions, a current set of competencies were reviewed. So you see the ASD 2004 competency models were reviewed, and enhanced competency was actually suggested by actually the changing and replacing and adding some competencies based on the characteristics of Web 2.0 Web 2.0 and competence studies. These tables actually summarize the lists of competencies required for enhanced competencies at the Web 2.0. So I'll explain each competency in detail from now on. So 2004 competency actually suggests 3 areas as importance for the competencies. The first area is about interpersonal competencies. The first competency is building trust. So building trust is also important at the age of Web 2.0. However, due to the increasing importance of social networking, HR professionals should build ethics for social networking too. They have to respect for social contracts and build transparent rules and so on. Now, another competencies in the area of interpersonal competency is communicating effectively. This is an important competency. However, HR professionals should also have the ability to capture the different features of Web 2.0 technologies. The third competency is to influence stakeholders. However, given the multiple perspectives are available at the age of Web 2.0, HR professionals should pay attention to what various people is saying and try to collect everyone's thoughts before making decisions. The last competencies include leveraging diversity and networking and partnering. So these competencies are also important for the HR professionals at the age of Web 2.0. However, the priority should be paid for the collective intelligence. It's how to harness collective intelligence. Let's move to the second area of the competencies, which is business management and business and management competencies. And analyzing needs and proposing solutions is reported as important competencies. So, however, given the importance of the multiple perspectives and the multiple sources are available at the age of Web 2.0, lead assessment input is more important. So, HR professionals should move to their focus from a creator of curriculum to a coordinator who arranges the dynamics of the systems. The second competency in the area of business management competency is planning and implementing assignments. It is reported that identifying opportunities for improvement is important, especially to pursue the well-defined goals. However, these competencies provide a sense of predeterminations. So given the complexity and dynamics of the Web 2.0, HR professionals first remain open to such dynamic changes and need to develop strategies for dealing with ill-structured problems consisting of constraints defined vaguely and uncertainty. The last competency area is about personal competencies. It includes demonstrating adaptability and modeling personal development. So, however, given the importance of the user's creations, so HR professionals should inspire many people to create solutions of their choices that are meaningful to both individuals and organizations instead of maintaining effectiveness when they experience the problems. So these are the kind of the list of the competencies that can be reconsidered at the age of Web 2.0. How about the factor of technologies? Actually, 2004 competency model actually includes technology as an important foundations competencies. Knowing and applying technology is very critical for HR professionals. However, it cannot exchange expertise area of human resource professionals. Technology rather should be regarded as tools to think and learn with. So in conclusions, for the HR professionals' competencies, HR professionals should focus on the three areas. First, they have to listen to multiple sources of information to harness collective intelligence in terms of interpersonal competencies. And that they should remain open to dynamic changes to dealing with ill-structured problems in terms of business and management areas. And they also need to shift the focus of focus to the users to make more meaningful solutions to students or the users in terms of the personal dimensions. These actually, the list of competencies is just already draft of the model that I try to develop. So a more systemic approach is needed to develop a comprehensive model, and then also a validation of the model is needed and quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Song. And finally, our last speaker is Dr. Lee Su from Chung-Ang University. He is the Dean of the Global Hrd School and Human Resource Development Program. And he's the leading expert about the Global HRD program. And he will be present about beyond HRD practitioner and into the professional in global HRD context.
Thank you. This is my honor to present our papers with Dr. Watkins, and Dr. Luna, and Dr. Sobel. This presentation was made by Dr. Chung-Ang and Dr. Professor Johnson. So it is the result of the collaboration. Most of the audiences are Korean, so they are speaking. 크게 그 세 섹션입니다. 그리고 저희들은 뭐 프로그램보다는 GHRF의 그 정책 분야 중심으로 말씀을 드리고자 합니다. 첫 번째는 제가 좀 뻥이 센 사람이었는데 정책에서도 좀 그런 것 같아서 좀 하이프를 넘어서 어떤 그 전문직으로 좀 가야 되지 않는가 하는 이러한 느낌으로 말씀을 드리겠습니다. 첫 번째는 그 비욘드 HRD 하이프 이런 면에서 볼 때 저의 그 개인적인 기억으로 더 파노라마 오브 코리안 HRD 이런 것을 살펴보면은 우리가 그 IMF의 그 파이낸셜 크라이시스 재정 위기를 극복하기 위해서 인적자원개발 기본법을 만들고 교육 인적자원으로 바꾸고 경제발전 5개년 계획에 상응하는 국가 인적자원개발 기본 계획을 만들고 이렇게 글로벌 HR 컨퍼런스가 개최되는 것도 어떤 면에서는 이 한국 HR의 그 파노라마를 보는 것 같습니다. 그런 면에서 볼 때 사실은 여기에 계신 모든 분들이 영어로 보면 이거저스티드라고 되어 있는데 지쳐 있어요. 우리의 그 번아웃 디그리를 잰다면 굉장히 아마 하이 레벨에서 아마 병원에 가야 될 정도로 어떤 면에서 저는 이것을 표현하기를 그리스 로마 신화에 나오는 그 미국 레비린스에 갇혀 있는 코리안 HRD maybe a captive of 레비린스. 그래서 좀 탈출구가 좀 없을까 그 웨이아웃을 찾으려는 이러한 그냥 문학적 시도였습니다. Do you know? 그러니까 볼 때는 그 글을 쓸 때는 그 첫 번째 그 실마리 스레드를 쓰는 게 참 괴로운 것 같아요. 그래서 첫 페이지만 쓰면은 나머지 쓰는 것은 그냥 쉽게 쓰는. 제가 루나 선생님 글을 볼 때 그 코어빌리티 여기에서 볼 때 레비린스에서 같이 있는 그 명주시를 건네주는 그런 아리아 등내와 같은 그런 역할을 봤다면은 우리 그 와킨즈 선생님께서는 그 휴먼 디벨로퍼의 그 매니 보이시즈 보았던 그 매니 보이시즈, 매니 페이시즈, 휴먼 디벨로퍼를 어떠한 메타포로 쓸 것인가 이것이 저한테 큰 인사이트를 준 것 같아요. 근데 그러면 결국 어디로 갈까 하는 때는 어떤 면에서는 제가 이스마이아는 승리 아까 서베로히어 서베로의 그 이펙티브 컨티뉴 에듀케이션 포 프로페셔널 여기에서 우리가 그 탈출구를 찾을 수 있지 않을까. 그래서 저희의 그 프레젠테이션 이렇게 크게 그 세 분의 글을 중심으로 이것을 좀 말씀드리고자 합니다. 그럴 때 그 첫 번째 문제점은 저희가 하고 싶은 말은 사실 여기 다 있습니다. 우리 송 교수님의 발표를 들어봐도 그렇지만 저는 한국은 어떤 면에서 컴피턴스 신드롬에 걸린 것 같다. 뭐든지 어디 가든지 키 컴피턴스 그럴 때마다 저는 난 역량이 없는가 이렇게 좀 자문을 하는데 그래서 제가 첫 번째 문제를 제기하고자 하는 것은 패러다임, 퍼스펙티브는 컴피턴스에 앞선다. I think 퍼스펙티브 프리시즈 컴피턴스 왜냐하면은 퍼스펙티브가 제대로 잡혀져 있지 않을 때 컴피턴스 문제는 의미가 없다는 것이 저의 첫 번째 포인트입니다. 두 번째는 우리가 그 HRD라고 하는 사람은 많지만은 정말 이 사람들이 프로인가, 약장사인가 이런 느낌을 갖는다는 겁니다. 그래서 HRD 그 담당자들의 그 정체성 논쟁 이런 면에서 볼 때 그 교육학에서는 교사의 자질, 교육의 질은 교사의 질을 넘지 못한다고 하는데 왜 이러한 논의가 우리 HRD에서는 없는가 하는 부분. 마지막으로 한국에서의 HRD는 NHRD와 RHRD로 그 크게 두 술에 막히는데 이것을 보면 어떤 면에서 스페이셜 어프로치, 공간적 접근 느낌을 준다. 왜 지역, 국가 이렇게 지리적 접근을 할 것인가. 오히려 좀 글로벌 시대라면 글로벌 HRD나 어떤 전략적 접근이 필요한 것이 아닌가. 즉 공간을 뛰어넘자 하는 것이 저의 네 번째 포인트입니다. 그래서 두 번째는 그 글로벌 컨텍스트를 저는 리차드 프리드만 책을 참 좋아합니다. 올리브 나무와 레서스하고 올리브 나무. 아마 레서스 선전으로 이 책만큼 좋은 선전이 없을 것 같아요. 저는 그 마커드 교수를 그렇게 썩 좋아하지는 않지만은 그분의 그 퍼티를 가지고 한번 한국을 분석할 수 있는 컨셉적 프레임워크를 쓸 수 있을 것 같다는 뜻입니다. 그러면서 한국은 트레이드 면에서는 세계 11위, 그 다음에 테크놀로지 면에서는 사이언스는 5위, 뭐 이렇게 쭉 외국인 그 투어리스트, 그 다음에 텔레비전, 인터넷 사용을 볼 때는 글로벌라이제이션은 미래가 아니고 한국 편에서는 현실이다 이미. 그러면서 볼 때 그 한국이 좀 선택을 잘한 것은 그 올리브 나무를 붙잡고 있기보다는 최신과 그 레서스를 투구하는 것이 그런 면에서 볼 때 우리는 이제는 HRD 논의를 글로벌 맥락에서 전개해야 되지 않을까 하는 것이 저의 그 논지입니다. 그 다음에 그 글로벌 시대에 보면 HRD와 글로벌 간의 그 전목 이 부분이 좀 취약하지 않았는가. 그러면서 볼 때는 우리가 업스킬링 해야 되고, 그 다음에 글로벌 탤런트를 끌어들여야 되고, 그 다음에 HR을 문화적 수준을 맞추고 이런 것이 전부 글로벌라이제이션과 관련되어 있는데, 제가 생각하는 점은 좀 이렇습니다. HRD 하는 사람들이 글로벌화에 영향을 미쳤다기보다도 글로벌화가 오히려 HRD 하는데 HRD 담당자들한테 영향을 주었는데도 그 영향을 제대로 소화를 해내지 못하고 있는 것이 아닌가. 이런 면에서 볼 때 우리가 좀 이제는 그 HRD 담당자들의 시각을 글로벌화 쪽으로 좀 돌려야 할 것이다 하는 것이 저의 문제의식입니다. 그렇다면 우리가 이러한 갇힌 미국에서 탈출구를 제가 생각하는 것은 HRD와 CP 간의 그 결혼 이것이 좀 빨리 이루어져야 되지 않을까. 그런데 아까 우리 서베리 교수님께서 경험 상황을 말씀하셨지만 우리 HRD 하는 사람들이 의사들이나 간호사들한테 와서 내가 뭐 좀 도와줄게 하는 사람들이 아마 피식 웃지 않을까. 네가 뭘 안다고, 네가 나한테 무슨 도움이 된다고. 그런 것이 우리 한국의 현실인 것 같다. 그래서 볼 때 우리나라가 거창하게 NHRD, RHRD 이런 것을 떠들 것이 아니라 그러한 정책의 성공의 키를 준 것은 HRD 프랙티셔너들의 그 역량을 높여주는 데 있다는 것이 저의 마지막 웨이아웃입니다. 그러면서 우리 루나 선생의 Journey for the Professionals 따라서 한번 좀 말씀을 드린다면은 저는 첫 번째 가장 중요한 것은 왜 지금 오늘 미국의 대통령 선거를 하는데 클린턴 대통령 때 선거 카피 중에 유명했던 것이 하버드 논쟁 아닙니까? It's the economic stupid. 그런 것처럼 중요한 것은 It's the profession stupid. 물론 여러분들은 stupid은 아니지만은 그러면서 볼 때 professionalization 이 부분이 가장 한국의 중요한 크리티컬 포인트가 아닌가 이런 생각을 갖고 있습니다. 그래서 조금 이런 것을 대학 프로페셔널의 특징 중에 하나는 제가 보기엔 라이프롱 러너 평생 학습자가 되어야 하는데 이 HRD 담당자들은 남은 인적자원 개발시키기는 원하지만 정작 자기 자신을 개발하는 데는 등한시한다는 점. 이런 면에서 대학원 수준으로 업그레이드를 할 필요가 있고 두 번째는 HRD 담당자들이 내들에 따르면 프로페셔널리 아이덴티파이 할 필요가 있다는 겁니다. 직무의 일환이거나 로테이션의 일환으로 할 수 없이 하는 것이 아니라 자기의 그 본업 정신으로 프로페셔널리 아이덴티파이 하는 그런 도와줄 필요가 있고, 세 번째는 우리가 조금 HRD 하면 저는 좀 학문적 배경이 서양이다 보니까 좀 크리티컬 시어리가 강한 편인데, HRD는 제가 보기에는 브로저 학문 같은 느낌을 많이 받았습니다. 그리고 지배하는 패러다임은 그 펑셔널 패러다임이 지배하다 보니까 대안적 논의가 좀 약하다 하는 겁니다. 늘 그러면서 볼 때 우리가 우리 스스로를 레비던스, 그 미궁에다가 HRD를 가져놓고선 그 안에서 작은 것을 논의하기보다는 우리가 이 어떤 면에서는 이 펑셔널리스트 퍼스펙티브 자체가 우리를 가두는 착고 역할을 하는 것은 아닌지, 그러면서 그때 저는 이 여러 가지 시각 간의 체크 앤 밸런스가 필요하다는 것이 저희 그 세 번째 요점입니다. 네 번째는 좀 너무 이 한국이란 여기도 작은데 그 안에서 뭐 RHR도 어떻고 NHR도 어떻고 보다는 시야를 아예 글로벌로 넘기고 시공을 초월한 어떤 스트라테지 HRD 쪽으로 나가는 것이 낫지 않을까 하는 점입니다. 저 스페이스 베이스드 어프로치에 그 컨스트레인트 되지 말자 하는 것이 제 생각입니다. 네 번째는 HRD 하는 사람들은 좀 제가 좋아하는 것은 좀 서양이다 보니까 컴퍼니 모델 하면은 한국의 HRD 하면 컴퍼니 HRD로 연상이 됩니다. 그럼 컴퍼니 HRD 하면 이코노믹 프로핏을 우선합니다. 그리고 쉐어홀더, 스톡홀더의 인터레스트를 또 먼저 우선시하는데, 그렇게 되다 보면은 우리 스스로 HRD 영역이 좁아질 수밖에 없다. 오히려 from company model to community model. 그래서 저는 그 공동체 중심으로 오히려 그 이해관계자를 좀 챙기고, 그다음에 이코노믹 베너핏, 프로핏보다는 소셜 베너핏을 또 고려하는 이러한 쪽이 우리 HRD의 레이아웃이 아닐까 하는 그런 생각을 좀 해봤습니다. 여섯 번째는 우리가 HRD와 CP 간의 긴밀한 협력, 이 부분이야말로 앞으로 한국에서는 평생교육과 인적자원 개발, 이 부분이 공동으로 살 수 있는 부분이 아닐까 이런 생각을 해보고, 마지막으로 한국에서는 그렇게 시장과 대학을 신뢰하지 않는다. 예를 들면 인적자원 개발사라는 그 자격증이 있다고 하면은 그런 자격증은 국가가 주는 자격증이었지만 시장에서 효용 가치가 있다는 겁니다. 그런데 그 인적자원개발기본법에는 가칭 인적자원개발사 이에 대한 제도가 미비되어 있기 때문에 장기적으로 보면 인적자원개발기본법을 개정해서라도 인적자원개발의 전문가를 위한 인적자원개발사의 어떤 법적 제도적 장치가 필요하지 않을까 하는 것으로 제 발표를 마치도록 하겠습니다. 왜냐하면 여러분들이 기다리는 것은 제 발표가 아니라 세계적인 학자들과의 디스커션일 것 같아서 여기서 마치도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. This is excellent presentation. Now we're going to have a Q&A session. Before we start the Q&A session, would you please to come forward to sit on the podium to answer the questions? And since we record, if you have a question, just come forward and using this microphone and ask questions. And you may have this translated because they might be question in Korean. So this several Watkins. Any questions? You may ask question using Korean. There's an excellent translator, so you need to speak English. We have plenty of time, so just feel free and relax. Would you tell me yourself first and then ask questions?
제가 안녕하세요 해도 되겠습니까?
네, 그렇습니다.
네, 안녕하세요. 저는 인천국제공사 교육계획팀의 조정원입니다. 이런 회의를 처음 참석했는데요. 글로벌 HRD라는 이렇게 용어를 상당히 많이 쓰고 있습니다. 물론 이제 글로벌 어떤 분께서 글로벌 HRD의 D란 약간 짧은 정의를 내려주셨으면 좋겠고요. 두 번째는 많은 HR 전문가들이 자기 직무에 대해서는 상당히 전문성을 띠고 있는데 흔히 기업 측면에서 보면은 글로벌 하다 보니까 주로 이제 어학 분야에 많이 치중해 있습니다. 그래서 과연 이게 직무 능력이 우선인가 아니면 어학 능력이 우선인가, 그리고 많은 기업들이 이제 어학 분야를 직무와 연계시켜서 비즈니스 잉글리시라든가 비즈니스 랭귀지를 주장하는 편인데 과연 이게 한국 내에 좀 특수한 상황이라고 볼 수 있죠. 이런 부분에 대한 어떤 해결책이 있는지, 어떤 방향으로 글로벌 HRD 역량을 키워나갈 수 있는지 설명을 부탁드리겠습니다. 질문들은 답은 좀 전문가이신 분이 좀 해주시면 좋겠는데 누구라고 딱히 지적을 못하겠습니다. 과연 이제 웬디 교수님께서 글로벌 HRD 네, 그는 저기 최교수님께서 좀 설명을 부탁드리겠습니다.
You bring up a very good question about how you define global HRD. To be honest, although I consider myself quite an expert on definitional issues in the field, I don't know of anyone who's asserted a real operational definition of global HRD. We do have some emerging around national HRD, and we certainly have different definitions of international and cross-cultural. But for where I've been reading over the last 5 years, I'm not sure that we can operationalize what global HRD really means. Anybody want to add to that?
I would add that there are no definitions that I'm aware of as well. I love the idea, however, and I think it fits very well with the kind of emphasis on global mindset. That really, if we train people well to the human resource development field, in our current context, they will be people who understand how to work at a global level, who are not just focused, as you said, on language, but more on dealing with diverse cultures, able to train managers who can do that as well. So I think it's a global citizen that we're looking for. It's a way of thinking and a way of being that a human resource developer has to be, that is not bounded by a national culture or a regional one, but rather able to work across borders of all types.
And I might add on that, I'm not sure that that would be any different than any other profession, right? I mean, every profession, it has to be that global citizen right now. So the notion of global HRD then is where, I question is what would be different around HRD globally? It's a big question. Maybe it's a term we're throwing around. So that was one. You had a few questions. Maybe others want to tackle. You had a question about This English. Right, English.
I think only that I would support your idea that is, sorry, I do agree that that's not enough, that a focus on language does not equal global HRD. But on the other hand, I think the other points that people have made is that it is through language that when you share a language, you can understand someone at a much more intimate level. You can understand how they reason and think about things. So without a common language, I think it does hamper our ability to work across borders. If I could ask for anything, it would be for all of us to be multilingual. But short of that, we do need some common language, whatever that, but at least within our own profession.
제가 하나만 더 추가 질문해도 될까요? 과장님께서. 제 질문드리는 핵심은요, 이 두 번째 아까 질문에 관한 사항인데요. 이게 단순하게 랭귀지 프로그램에 대해서 이렇게 논하자는 게 아니고요. 질문드리는 게 아니고, 과연 보통 그 글로벌 HRD 내지는 글로벌 인재를 양성하는 데 있어서 기본적인 언어가 돼야 된다는 것은 세일즈 관점에서 볼 때, 그러니까 판매자라든가 우리가 어떤 판매 루트를 개척하거나 우리가 다른 데서 얻을 수 있는 수익이 있을 경우에 글로벌이라는 어떤 능력이 필요하지, 우리가 사는 클라이언트 입장에서는 과연 글로벌 능력이 필요한가? 이 클라이언트와 이렇게 소비자와 서플라이어와 소비자 입장에서는 관점이 좀 틀리거든요. 근데 그게 과연 우리 쪽에서 그렇게 필요한 능력인가? 많은 기업들이 수많은 예산을 들여가면서 이 글로벌이라는 미명하에 엄청난 자금을 투자하고 있고 그 능력을 실현시키고 있는데 과연 이런 부분에 대해서는 어떻게 한국형 글로벌화에 적게 투자를 하면서 많은 효과를 볼 수 있는 건가, 그리고 과연 이게 필요한가, 그걸 주로 한국 교수님들께 좀 질문을 드리고 싶습니다.
저도 제가 생각하기엔 그렇습니다. 글로벌화를 어떻게 접근할 것이냐. 제가 보기에는 첫 번째는 그 글로벌 스탠다드라는 관점에서 접근할 것입니다. 딱 글로벌화 하면 이러이러한 스탠다드가 있으니 이러한 스탠다드를 충족시켜야 한다는 접근하는 있는 것 같습니다. 또 다른 접근은 그것이 글로벌 스탠다드냐 글로벌 와이드냐, 그래서 범세계적으로 미치는 그 현상이라고 접근할 때는 지금 선생님께서 말씀하신 것처럼 중동 지역의 HRD는 어떻고 일본 극동 지역은 어떻게, 그러다 보면 굉장히 세분화해서 이렇게 접근하는 것이 또 있을 것 같고, 그 다음에 원초적으로 제가 보기엔 아까 말씀하신 대로 세일즈 면에서 우리 기업이 로컬 기업에서 글로벌 기업을 하다 보니까 그렇게 범세계적인 글로벌 기업에 맞는 그런 인력 기업을 접근된 것이 아닌가 하는 느낌을 받는데, 저의 생각은 그렇습니다. 오늘날 글로벌 시대라고 하든 지식경제 시대라고 하든 필요한 것은 제가 보기에는 유명 어떤 사람이 재밌게 쓴 표현인데 forward to the basics, 우리는 back to the basics를 했는데 그것이 아니라 전향적으로, 즉 우리가 어떤 특정한 컴피턴스나 어떤 특정 잡 스페시픽한 것 또는 인더스트리 스페시픽한 것 가르쳐봤자 2, 3년을 못 버틴다. 그렇다면 글로벌 시대에 정작 필요한 것은 forward to the basics, 제너럴한 것, 그러한 부분이 제대로 가르쳐지고 나머지는 그런 것은 현업에서 배우면 충분하다. 그러면서 글로벌 HRD라고 해서 엄청난 새로운 것이 아니라 어떤 면에서는 요즘 그렇게 보이시나 이에서 많이 나온 뉴 베이직스 같은 이런 부분이 나오는 것도 어떤 면에서 우리가 그 베이직하고 제너럴한 것, 그것이 진정으로 그 글로벌한 것이 아닐까. 저는 세분화해서 뭐 이것이 당신한테 맞는 역할이고 이런 컴퓨터스 길러준다 해봤자 늘 경제적 효과 가치가 없을 것이다 하는 것이 제 생각입니다.
안녕하십니까. 전 현대차그룹의 현대로템에서 교육관 나오고 있는 이상진 과장입니다. 루에나 선생님께 제가 질문을 하고 싶은데요. 지금 저희 지식 기반 사회라고 하면서 저희 우리 한국에서도 굉장히 지식 관리에 대한 그 중요성이 굉장히 높다고 합니다. 그런데 제가 생각할 때 아까 발표하신 말씀 중에 지식 관리를 더 잘하기 위해서는 관료제화의 상황에서는 거의 성공할 수 없다고 그렇게 제가 들었거든요. 그래서 아무래도 이렇게 플렉스블한 조직일 때 이렇게 지식 기반으로 이렇게 향해 갈 수 있을 것 같은데 아마 저희가 이제 기업에서 교육을 담당하는 입장으로서 그런 사회를 가고 싶다 이거죠. 가고 싶은데 그런 한국 기업에 필요한 것이 무엇이고 기업들한테 요구되는 상황이 무엇이고 HRD 담당자로서 어떻게 이렇게 조직을 해서 혼자만 힘은 안 되겠지만 아주 힘이 될 수 있는 역할이라든지 그런 필요한 점이 무엇인지에 대해서 그래서 질문을 하고 싶습니다.
Prerequisite, I'll start there. Just like with any HRD initiative, as I'm sure you well know, it's top leadership support and a true understanding of what it will take to implement knowledge management, that it truly is intervening on a social system, right? And to have top leaders who fundamentally understand that and are willing to make not only the financial investment, but also the investment of time, energies, and their own learning to help to shift all of the kinds of things that need to be shifted. In terms of HRD role, what I would offer you is every single one of the challenges that I laid out, I absolutely believe are in our purview. In our program at the University of Georgia, the name of our program, Dr. Watkins, when she birthed our program, it's Human Resource and Organizational Development. We really do emphasize in our program, and it is certainly my philosophy, that we have to be organizational interventionists. And so to think about the challenges I outlined and then go to our HRD toolbox, as it were, and start to think about all of the multiple interventions that we really do have to consciously orchestrate and design effective systems around in a multi-pronged approach towards making knowledge management succeed. So just like Dr. Severo said, there's no magic bullets. It's a systemic approach. And you can imagine if you were truly, if I had a magic wand and unlimited resources, which all of us have, right? we would really want to outline a plan, a multi-pronged plan to address those things. And you can see it would be a long march, as Dr. Lee said.
예, 저는 일조학에서 교육하고 조직문화를 담당하고 있는 김수홍 부장입니다. 예, 제가 궁금한 거는 저는 사실 이공계 출신이었는데 제가 변화를 되게 좋아했습니다. 그래서 화학을 하다가 인간의 변화를 위해서 제가 교육에 투신을 했는데 하다 보니까 이제 교육은 변화의 길이다라는 나름대로의 체험을 가지고 있습니다. 그래서 일을 하다 보니까 HRD하고 OD하고 조직문화 OC라고 들었는데 이 세 가지 중에 세 가지가 각각의 개념적 차이가 있는지 하고 변화를 위해서 가장 차이가 난다면 변화를 위해서 가장 중요한 효과적인 부분이 HR인지 OD인지 OC인지 그걸 좀 구분을 갖고 싶습니다. 어떻게 차이가 나는 건지 하고 어떻게 가장 효과적인 변화에 풀이 될까 좀 여쭤보고 싶다. 그리고 이제 조지아 대학의 HROD라는 어떤 그런 프로그램이 있어서 그런 차원에서 좀 어떤 것들이 제공되고 있는지 좀 보고 싶습니다.
You could probably tell from my work that I put a lot of emphasis on the organizational culture, because I do think that this is where you can embed lasting change, and you can reach many more people. I think change has to be change of all of the people. It can't be focused only at the top. So for me, I would probably put a lot of my eggs in the organizational culture basket. On the other hand, we've created the program to be both HRD and OD because we felt that organizational culture was part of organizational development. That if we could, the way we began thinking about this is that in the beginning, human resource development was predominantly training. It was on-the-job training and trainers post-World War II doing very technical kinds of almost vocational training. We felt that if we were going to have a graduate program that would train people for the future, that they had to have a longer-term perspective. And so in a way, I guess I think that trainers grow up to be organizational change agents. And so the graduate program does strongly emphasize strategic HRD and organizational change and development, and the role that learning can play in changing the fabric and culture of an organization. So I think Craig Lundberg said that organizational learning upwings the distance vision of organization development, and I believe that as well. That if you think of that as almost like a ladder, that as you grow in the field, you may start as a trainer, and then you may move to more of a consultant, which begins to be more of a change agent. And then as you go higher in the organization, in your maturity in your own work, you have more network, more social capital, you can begin to make change and to be truly a change agent working with leadership to bring about major significant shifts in the organization. And then maybe in my mind at least, at the peak of that work, you can be helping to change the karma in the walls and halls of the organization to emphasize learning lifelong. And that to me would be the kind of evolution that I would seek and why we built the program the way we did.
I might be a little stronger in some of that and say, for me, HRD is by definition the integrated use of training and development and organizational development. So as I think about professional standards and certification and professionalization, for me, it's fundamentally you are an HRD professional if you are carrying forward these notions of integrated use. And so while you may functionally have that entry role of training, if you call yourself an HRD professional, I want that person to understand that there is a system on which to intervene, and there is more complex work around that training event for even training to be successful, and to understand that you are an HRD professional serving one role. And so that's how I train my students, that's how I think about the profession, and I emphasize that integration. Otherwise, what I tell folks is, then if you aren't committed to the integrated use of those things, then you are a trainer or you are an organizational development person. But if you're an HRD, you must be both, right? And I think that's the real difference. A lot of people in organizational development look to us in HRD and say, well, how are you any different from us? And one of my answers is always, we still do hold on to the learning paradigm and the learning processes and the developmental processes, particularly at the individual level, that I don't see them worrying about enough in organizational development, which in the United States tends to be almost a different profession than HRD. So, another perspective.
And, the point of my talk was in the real world of medical care in hospitals, you cannot do without both interventions. And I mean, the research evidence is clear. People are dying because in hospitals because both are not being taken care of at the same time. So I think it's not an abstract question. I mean, I think it's a real question of how to improve businesses, and including hospitals, which operate as a business. So I think I would certainly echo the notion of the integration, at least in the healthcare system, which is where most of my experiences.
The last question, since we don't have much time.
네. 세르벨 교수님께 질문하고 싶습니다. 저는 이비인후과 하고 있는 의사입니다. 의사들의 이제 졸업 후 교육에 대해서 언급을 하셨는데요. 지금 미국에서는 학회라든가 그런 여러 가지 연수 교육을 통해서 지속적인 교육을 하고 있다고 알고 있는데요. 단순히 아까 예로 이제 사람들이 사망하는 걸 예를 드시면서 교육이 필요하다고 말씀하셨는데, 연수 교육이나 그런 과정의 교육 외에 다른 교육 방법이 혹시 있는지, 그리고 두 번째 질문입니다. 두 번째는 지금 이제 HRD 평소에 관심이 많아서 이제 보고 있었는데요. HRD에서 우리가 취급해야 되는 것이 사람의 재능인지 아니면 그 사람이 갖고 있는 시간인지, 거기에 대한 고견 부탁드리겠습니다.
Did you say you were a physician? Yes. Okay. So in the United States, there are 4 major providers, organizations that provide education and learning for physicians and really all healthcare professionals. I would say the most effective and the vast majority of this is done in hospital settings. And probably the second type of education is provided by universities. So medical schools will offer courses to alumni or anybody who would like to attend. The third type of provider of education are the professional societies. I guess we have professional. I assume you have professional societies here. Usually based in specialty groups, such as American Cardiology Association and such. And the fourth major provider are for-profit companies that operate to just provide seminars. There's also quite a bit of collaboration among these types of providers, but I think that, as I mentioned, the emerging consensus in medical care is that the workplace is the best place for the provision of continuing education, because it's where physicians practice, and it's much the access to their care and the quality of their care is right there and can be brought into to help design the educational process. So those are the 4 major providers. And I might add one last point on this, is that an absolutely major issue facing medical education right now is the medical care is the role of pharmaceutical companies in funding continuing education. and the idea that the pharmaceutical companies are only going to fund the kind of education that's going to increase product share for their own particular pharmaceutical. So that's really getting in the way of providing effective continuous learning, because it's more about the bottom line of the pharmaceutical companies than it is about effective patient care. Talent. I mean, obviously, you need both. I mean, I think the focus of my talk was that we've put a lot of emphasis on talent identification in medicine. Only the absolute brightest people get into medical school, so talent identification we're very good at. But the brightest person without lifelong learning is going to turn into a non-effective physician. I don't think there's any question about that. The conditions of medical care change, the knowledge changes, and skills deteriorate. And so you could put the most talented, brightest person, best trained person going to the best medical school, and unless they continue to learn over time, it's just they're not going to be able to provide the care.
Okay, thank you. We're going to finish 3-hour-long first session. I'd like to first of all, would like to really thank you to the two translators who did excellent translate Korean to English, English to Korean, and big applause to. And also thank you to all presentator and audience. Thank you.